In 1922, a quiet farm in rural Germany became the stage for one of the most brutal and baffling murder cases in history. 6 people, an entire family and their maid, were slaughtered inside their own home. Their skulls crushed with a heavy farming tool, their bodies hidden beneath hay and blankets, while the killer calmly stayed behind, living in the farmhouse as if it were their own. When worried neighbors finally entered the property, the horror revealed itself piece by piece. In the barn, 4 family members lay dead, covered in straw, as though someone had tried to erase the scene. Inside, the maid was discovered lifeless in her bed. And in the nursery, the smallest victim, just 2 years old, killed in his crib. It was a sight so gruesome that even the most experienced officers could barely speak. But what happened in the days that followed was even stranger. Smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney. Fresh meals appeared on the kitchen table. The cows had been milked, the livestock fed. Someone was living in the house after the murders, and yet nothing was stolen. Money and jewelry remained untouched, sitting in plain sight. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was cold, deliberate, and personal. The case shook the entire region. Villagers whispered theories: a stranger hiding in the woods, a vengeful neighbor, or someone the family had trusted all along. Police launched one of the largest investigations of the era, but every clue only deepened the mystery. Over a century later, the crime is still unsolved. The Gruber family lived on a quiet farmstead known for its isolation. Their days were simple: tending to fields, feeding animals, and keeping to themselves. From the outside, life appeared ordinary. But inside those walls, unease was growing. Andreas Gruber, the head of the household, was not an easy man. Neighbors often described him as stern, even harsh. His wife, Cecilia, shared the farmhouse with him, along with their widowed daughter Victoria and her 2 children, little Cecilia and Joseph. The farm had recently taken on a maid to help with housework, but it was not an easy place to live. Cold, remote, and overshadowed by tension, Hinterkaifeck was not a home where laughter came easily. It was during the last days of March that things began to feel stranger. Andreas noticed footprints in the snow one morning, coming from the forest toward the farm. He followed the trail carefully. The prints led straight to the house, but there were none leading back out. Whoever had made them seemed to have vanished, without a trace. That night, faint noises echoed from the attic. Slow, deliberate steps. Scratching sounds. Andreas searched the space with a lantern, every corner checked, but nothing was there. The next night, it happened again. The family tried to ignore it, but fear had already settled in. Then, a set of house keys went missing. The Grubers tore the house apart, searching every drawer, every pocket, every corner. They were never found. To lose keys on an isolated farm was unsettling enough, but to lose them at a time when strange footprints and unexplained noises had already disturbed them? It was more than coincidence. It meant someone could now enter the home whenever they wanted. One morning, Andreas discovered something else that deepened the mystery. A newspaper sat in the house, one he had never bought, one nobody in the family recognized. He asked neighbors, but none had delivered it. Somehow it had appeared inside their farmhouse as though placed there by unseen hands. The maid at the time, already nervous from the noises and atmosphere, grew convinced the farm was cursed. She confided in others that she felt unsafe, that she could not rest easy within the farmhouse walls. Not long after, she packed her belongings and left. Later, she would tell people she felt fortunate to have escaped when she did. The family tried to continue life as usual, but the signs were impossible to ignore. The animals sometimes seemed restless, reacting to sounds no one else could hear. The nights grew heavier, filled with the tension of not knowing who or what was intruding upon their lives. Andreas mentioned the events to neighbors, speaking of the footprints, the missing keys, the noises in the attic. On March 31st, a new maid named Maria arrived at the farm. She came without knowing the stories. No one told her about the noises or the footprints or the missing keys. To her, it was just another job in a quiet, rural place. She greeted the family, settled into her room, and began her work. She had no idea she had less than a single day left to live. Looking back, every detail feels like a warning. The footprints, that ended at the house. The attic noises that returned night after night. The keys that disappeared. The unexplained newspaper. These were not random happenings. They were pieces of a larger plan. Someone had been watching the Grubers carefully, testing how far they could go without being discovered. For days, the Hinterkaifeck farm seemed unusually quiet. No smoke from the chimney, no sounds of animals being fed. No one seen working in the fields. By the fourth day, suspicion turned into concern. Victoria's daughter had not been to school. Deliveries were left untouched. The animals, usually tended with care, cried out in hunger. It was then that neighbors decided to check on the family. On April 4th, two men from the nearby village approached the farm. From the outside, everything looked still. The yard eerily deserted. The front door was locked, the windows shuttered. They called out, but no one answered. The only sounds were the restless cattle and the wind against the wooden barn. They decided to look inside. Moving cautiously toward the barn, one of them noticed the large wooden doors stood slightly ajar. He stepped inside first, pushing through the heavy silence. What they found froze them where they stood. There, beneath piles of hay, lay the bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia. The family had been brutally murdered, their lives taken with violent precision. They had been dragged together one by one and covered as though the killer had wanted to conceal them but not quite bury them. The barn was cold and dim, dust hanging in the air. Chickens clucked nervously in the rafters above, as if they too had sensed what lingered below. The smell was heavy, a mix of earth, hay, and something unmistakably metallic, the scent of blood long dried. Word spread quickly. More neighbors gathered at the edges of the farm, whispering in disbelief. Some peered through windows, but dared not go inside. Others covered their mouths, shaken by the thought that something this violent had happened so close, without a sound. It wasn't long before they pushed open the farmhouse doors. What they discovered inside only deepened the horror. In the maid's room, Maria lay lifeless in her bed. She had barely been on the farm for a single day before death found her. In the nursery, young Joseph was discovered in his cot, his short. Life ended before it had truly begun. Each room told the same story: sudden violence, followed by silence. There were no signs of a struggle loud enough to draw attention, no shattered doors or broken windows. Whoever had done this had moved through the house with terrifying control. The neighbors, overwhelmed by shock, could do little more than stand, frozen. Some prayed aloud, others argued whether to wait for the authorities or search the farm themselves. Fear rippled through the group. If the killer could wipe out an entire family unnoticed, who was to say they weren't still nearby? Hours later, the police arrived. They too were struck by the remoteness of the scene, the stillness of the farm. With lanterns and flashlights, they examined the barn first. The bodies, laid close together, showed evidence of blunt force injuries, wounds so severe they could only have come from a heavy tool. The investigators noted how they had been carefully arranged, almost deliberately placed beneath the hay. Moving inside, the officers documented the rooms. Maria's bed was disheveled, her body lying as if she had been struck while resting. Baby Joseph's cot was tucked neatly into the corner, blankets pulled up as though nothing had happened, and yet everything had. The ordinary details of the house only amplified the brutality. Fresh laundry sat folded on a chair. Bread and meat were left on the kitchen table, as if the family had been interrupted mid-routine. One detail disturbed the officers most: signs that the killer may have remained on the farm after the murders. Freshly baked bread, evidence of meals eaten, and the livestock cared for suggested someone had continued daily tasks in the days following the killings. Outside, the farmyard filled with more villagers, their voices low, their faces pale. Some swore they had seen smoke rising from the chimney days after the family had last been alive. Others remembered hearing strange noises in the evenings, but had dismissed them. Now those fragments of memory felt like warnings they had failed to heed. The police worked through the night, lantern light flickering against the wooden beams. They measured footprints, examined tools, and searched for signs of forced entry. But nothing added up. The doors were intact, the windows unbroken. Whoever had come into the farm had done so with knowledge and patience. By dawn, the crime scene had become more than a mystery. It was a nightmare. The farmhouse, once just another quiet rural home, was now sealed in darkness. The barn, where families usually gathered for work, had become a tomb, and the neighbors who once thought little of the Gruber's isolation now realized how dangerous it had truly been. As the sun rose, casting pale light over the yard, the farm looked almost ordinary again, but those who had seen inside knew nothing would ever be the same. 6 lives had been ended with brutal efficiency, and no one could explain how it had happened unnoticed. The questions began immediately. Who had the strength and determination to kill an entire family? Why had the animals been cared for, the house maintained, as if life continued? The crime scene offered no answers, only contradictions. The discovery of 6 bodies at the isolated farm shocked not only the neighbors, but the entire region. By the time more officers arrived, the farmhouse had already drawn a crowd. Villagers stood in silence, some crossing themselves, others whispering theories. The police quickly pushed them back, securing the yard with rope and ordering everyone away from the barn. This was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. Investigators began with what was most visible, the barn where 4 bodies had been found. They carefully photographed the positions, though the equipment of the time was primitive compared to modern standards. Each injury was documented, each angle studied. The brutality was clear, but the precision puzzled them. The killer had not acted in blind rage. The blows were methodical, each one deliberate. Soon detectives spread out across the property. They examined the farmhouse itself, checking locks, doors, and windows. To their surprise, none showed signs of forced entry. The doors were intact, the shutters firmly closed. Whoever had entered the house had either been invited in or knew how to move around without leaving a trace. One officer pointed out the strange fact that the animals were alive and well fed. The cows had been milked, the chickens fed. Even the dogs seemed calm, as though life had continued as normal after the murders. This raised a chilling possibility. Had the killer remained on the farm for days, blending into the family's routine as though nothing had happened? Neighbors were questioned immediately. Some admitted hearing strange noises on the nights before the discovery. Others claimed to have seen smoke rising from the chimney even after the Grubers were already dead. These details only deepened the mystery. If true, it meant the murderer had not fled immediately, but lingered, carrying on the family's daily tasks. Search teams fanned out around the property. Officers walked in wide circles, scanning the fields, ditches, and nearby woods. They looked for discarded weapons, footprints, or personal belongings. In one section of soft earth near the barn, they found boot prints leading toward the forest. But they stopped abruptly, as though the killer had vanished into thin air. As daylight faded, the investigation expanded. Lanterns illuminated the yard, officers calling out as they scoured the farm with systematic precision. Every corner of the barn, every stable, every tool was inspected. A mattock, a common farming tool, was suspected to be the murder weapon, though it was not immediately found. The absence of a weapon only made the crime harder to understand. The following day, authorities requested broader support. Local constables were joined by detectives from the city. Aerial searches were even attempted. Small aircraft flew over the surrounding forests and fields, scanning for signs of movement or abandoned camps. From the sky, the farm looked ordinary, a simple cluster of buildings surrounded by vast emptiness. But those below knew it was hiding secrets no eye could easily detect. Inside the farmhouse, investigators found unsettling details. On the kitchen table lay food that seemed freshly eaten. In the stove, ashes suggested recent fires. Beds appeared slept in after the murders. Whoever had killed the family might have stayed long enough to make himself comfortable. This discovery disturbed even the most seasoned officers. It was no longer just a question of who had committed the crime, but why they had chosen to remain afterward. Cops began canvassing nearby villages, questioning travelers, workers, and drifters. Suspicion fell on a number of people: a disgruntled farmhand who had left weeks earlier, relatives with old grudges, even strangers spotted passing through the area. Each lead seemed promising at first, but collapsed under scrutiny. The alibis held, the connections were weak, and none explained the controlled brutality of the murders. Forensic experts of the time struggled to make sense of the evidence. Blood patterns in the barn suggested that the victims had been attacked one by one, dragged together afterward. Yet no one could explain why the family had gone into the barn in the first place. Had they been lured by noises or forced at weapon? The lack of struggle within the house suggested they had walked out willingly. That single question haunted investigators. The search stretched for miles. Officers moved through forests with dogs looking for campsites or hidden shelters. Helicopters were not yet a regular part of police work in rural areas, but small aircraft were called in again, circling low, their engines echoing across the fields as villagers watched anxiously. No trace was found, no fleeing figure, no hidden weapon. The landscape swallowed every clue. Back at the farm, the officers were no closer to answers. Every detail contradicted the last. There was no forced entry, yet no reason for the family to suspect danger. There were footprints, yet they led nowhere. The victims were killed with extreme violence, yet afterward, the farm was maintained as if nothing had happened. Frustration grew among the investigators. Days turned into weeks, and the crime scene slowly shifted from fresh horror to unsolved puzzle. Files filled with witness statements and photographs, but none brought clarity. The farmhouse became a symbol of dread, standing in silence against the countryside, a place where even the police admitted they could not piece together the truth. Yet the killer remained a ghost. No one saw him arrive, no one saw him leave, and no one could understand why he had lingered. To the officers, it felt less like a solved crime and more like an open wound, one that refused to heal. As the investigation stretched into weeks, the focus shifted from the crime scene itself to the people who might have held a motive. Police were under pressure to deliver answers, and in a rural community where everyone knew each other's routines, suspicion quickly spread. The first and most obvious suspect was the family's former farmhand. He had been dismissed from his job months earlier after bitter arguments with the head of the household. Neighbors described him as resentful, even vengeful, and some claimed he had threatened the family before leaving. Investigators tracked him down, convinced that the brutality of the murders fit the profile of someone with pent-up rage. But his alibi stood firm. He had been hundreds of miles away working on another farm at the time of the killings. Records and witness accounts supported his story, leaving detectives frustrated. The simplest explanation had slipped through their hands. Attention then turned inward, toward the family itself. Old rumors resurfaced, whispers of conflicts and grudges that had festered behind closed doors. Some suggested that relatives living in nearby villages stood to gain from the family's property or wealth. Inheritance disputes, strained relationships, and long-standing bitterness became part of the narrative. Could someone close to them have planned their elimination for financial gain? Investigators questioned cousins, in-laws, and extended family members, but once again, the trail ran cold. No evidence directly tied them to the farm on the night of the murders. Neighbors provided another layer of intrigue. For weeks, villagers whispered among themselves, accusing one household after another, but no confession ever came. The investigation also considered strangers. The farm's isolated location made it a possible target for drifters or vagrants moving across the countryside. A passing criminal, desperate for food or shelter, could have stumbled upon the family, turned violent, and then lingered. But if that was the case, why were no valuables stolen? Money, jewelry, and food supplies were left untouched. Robbery didn't seem to be the motive. Some detectives believed the murders required a deeper knowledge of the farm itself. Whoever had committed the crime seemed familiar with the layout of the property and the daily routines of the victims. The way the bodies were discovered, the lack of forced entry, and the calm feeding of animals afterward suggested the killer was no outsider. This theory terrified the community. Years went by, but the unease never left. The community became divided. Some swore the murderer had to be an outsider, a stranger who slipped in and slipped out without leaving a trace. Others believed it was someone local, someone who used familiarity with the farm to their advantage, someone who could still be walking among them. Suspicion poisoned friendships, and every unexplained action was viewed as a potential clue. The farmhouse itself stood as a grim reminder. Windows broken by time, the roof sagging, weeds curling up through cracks in the foundation. But locals avoided it. They said the silence inside was too heavy, the air too cold, as if the place carried the memory of what had happened. Even children dared each other to go near, yet most refused to cross the threshold. It wasn't just a crime scene anymore, it was a scar on the entire community. Police files thickened with reports, yet none brought the closure families of the victims. Decades later, investigators who had worked the case admitted it was one of the most frustrating of their careers. Every piece of evidence led in two directions at once. Every suspect had motives, but also alibis. Every theory seemed to make sense, until it didn't. Historians, journalists, and crime enthusiasts continued to dissect the case, hoping that new eyes might uncover what the original detectives had missed. Articles were written, documentaries produced, each one breathing new life into the story, but never delivering the one thing everyone wanted: a name, a face, a clear answer. Over time, the mystery became larger than the crime itself. It wasn't just about who killed the family, but how someone could commit such an act, remain hidden for so long, and then vanish completely. What kind of mind could sit in that farmhouse after the murders, listening to the footsteps of searchers just outside? Some believed the truth was buried along with the victims, that the killer was someone now long dead, carrying the secret to the grave. Others argue the answer is still out there, waiting in forgotten evidence boxes or overlooked testimonies. Perhaps a missing detail, a slip of memory, or a chance discovery could still unlock the case. Until then, the story remains frozen in time, haunting anyone who comes across it. Each retelling revives the same unease, the same questions that have echoed for generations. How could an entire family vanish in their own home without anyone noticing? Who had the patience and audacity to live among their victims afterward? And most haunting of all, why was this family chosen? The farmhouse, though crumbling, still stands in silence. And with it stands the unanswered question. If the killer could escape justice once, could someone capable of such calculated cruelty still be walking free today? That uncertainty is what keeps this case alive, not only in the files of investigators, but in the imaginations of anyone who hears about it. It isn't just another unsolved murder. It is a puzzle that resists resolution, a story where every answer only leads to deeper shadows. And perhaps that is why, even after so many years, people continue to return to it, searching for patterns, clues, and meaning. Because until the truth is revealed, the farmhouse murders will remain one of the darkest, most unsettling mysteries in history. The story ends here, but the questions never do. If you want to keep exploring chilling mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe to Mystery Note, because sometimes the scariest stories are not the ones we invent, but the ones that remain unsolved.